Can you imagine standing amidst hundreds of people, watching the sons you've sacrificed your whole life to raise, leading another man to a seat reserved just for you? No explanation. Not a glance of apology, just a cold smile and a dismissive gesture toward a corner. That night, Graham Holloway, the silent father of a lifetime, decided that his silence had lasted long enough. Like, comment the city you're viewing in so I know how far this story has progressed. And don't leave, because what happens next will change everything. I want to tell you something before I get into the details of that night. I want you to understand that I am not the kind of man who makes scenes. Never have been. 41 years working in an auto shop will teach you that. You learn to keep your head down, work with your hands, solve what's in front of you, and let the noise of other people's opinions roll off your back like rain off a hood. That's how I was raised. That's how I raised Landon. Or at least, I thought that's how I raised him. My name is Graham Holloway. I'm 67 years old. I have grease permanently embedded under 2 of my fingernails from a job I did in 1987 that no amount of scrubbing ever fully fixed. I drive a 2009 Ford pickup that needs a new alternator. I still make my coffee on the stove in a percolator I bought at a garage sale in 1994. I am not a complicated man. I don't need much. What I needed, what I thought I had, was a son who knew where he came from. The night everything changed was a Saturday in October, cool enough that you could see your breath if you stood still too long outside. Landon's 5th wedding anniversary party, held at the Ashcroft Grand Ballroom. Yes, a ballroom named after his wife's family, which should have told me something right there, and the entire event was built to impress. 300 guests, a live orchestra, past appetizers on silver trays, ice sculptures carved into swans. The kind of party that costs more than I made in 5 years at the shop combined. I wore my good suit, the charcoal one I bought for Landon's wedding. I'd had it dry cleaned the week before, pressed it myself the morning of the event, polished my shoes until I could see my own reflection in the toe. My hands looked wrong in those clothes. Too rough, too scarred. But I told myself that didn't matter. This was my son's celebration. I would be proud, and I would smile, and I would shake hands with whoever I needed to shake hands with. I drove myself there. Nobody offered to pick me up. I found that strange at the time, but told myself they were busy. Landon and his wife, Serena, had been running around organizing the last-minute details. That's what I told myself. People get wrapped up in things. It doesn't mean anything. The ballroom was already half full when I arrived at 7. The ceiling was hung with thousands of small, warm lights, and somewhere above the crowd an orchestra was playing something I almost recognized. The room smelled like flowers and money. I walked through the entrance with my ticket. Yes, my ticket. For my own son's anniversary party, and a young woman in a black dress checked my name against a list on a tablet. Graham Holloway, I said. She scrolled for a second longer than I expected. Then she smiled, the way people smile when they found something they weren't sure was there. Yes, sir. You're at table 14. I thanked her and moved into the crowd. I didn't know anyone at table 14. I found that out when I got there, but a round table near the back left corner of the room, partially blocked from the main stage by a decorative pillar. 4 other people were already seated, a couple who seemed to be distant relatives of Serena's I'd never met, a business associate of Landon's whose name I couldn't catch over the music, and a woman who turned out to be someone's administrative assistant who had been invited, I later learned, out of courtesy. Nice people. Every one of them perfectly kind, but none of them were family. None of them were anyone Landon would have had a specific reason to want nearby. I sat down. I poured myself some water. I looked across the room at the center table, round, larger than the others, draped in ivory, sitting directly in front of the stage with an unobstructed view, and I saw the place card where my name was supposed to be. I know it was supposed to be there, because 2 weeks earlier when Serena had called me about the event, she'd said, "We've got you up front, Graham. Best seat in the house." Those were her exact words. I remember them because I'd said, "Oh, you don't have to do that." And she'd said, "Of course we do. You're family." The place card at the center table did not say Graham Holloway. It said Victor Ashcroft. Victor Ashcroft was Serena's father. 68 years old, broad-shouldered, silver-haired, with the kind of jaw that looked like it had been put there by someone with an agenda. He wore a tuxedo that fit him the way tuxedos fit men who have always had things fit them properly. He laughed loudly and often, the kind of laugh that expected the room to follow along, and generally it did. Victor had built his fortune in commercial real estate. He had given Landon and Serena the down payment on their first home, had funded the early stages of what became Landon's consulting firm, and had made absolutely certain over the past 5 years that no one in any room ever forgot either of those facts. He introduced himself at parties as the man behind the curtain. He said it like it was self-deprecating. It wasn't. I watched Victor settle into that center seat, my seat, the seat Serena herself had promised me, and I watched him adjust his cufflinks and accept a glass of champagne from a passing server and lean back in his chair like a man surveying land he owned. And then I looked for my son. Landon was across the room talking to a group of men in expensive suits. He was 34 years old and looked it in all the right ways. Tall, clear-eyed, dressed well. He had my jaw and his mother's eyes, and sometimes when he laughed a certain way, I could hear her in it. Ellen had been gone 6 years. She would have been at that center table if she were alive, I'm sure of that. She would have been there, and she would have had something funny to say about the ice swans. I watched Landon laugh at something one of the suit men said, and I thought maybe he hadn't noticed me yet. So I waited. I sat at table 14 with my water glass, and I waited for my son to look across the room and see me and come over. He found me about 20 minutes later. I could tell the moment he spotted me because his expression shifted, just slightly, just for a half second, in a way that was hard to read but not impossible. It wasn't relief. It wasn't the particular brightness that comes into a person's face when they see someone they were hoping to find. It was something closer to management. "Dad," he said, coming over and shaking my hand. He shook my hand. His own father, and he shook my hand like I was a contractor he was meeting for the first time. "Hey, son." I stood up. "Good to see you. This place is something." "Yeah, Serena's team really pulled it together." He glanced around the table. "You good here? You need anything?" "I'm fine." I paused. "I thought Serena said I'd be up front." Something moved across his face. It was fast, but I caught it. He cleared his throat, and when he spoke again, his voice had that particular kind of careful in it. The kind where the speaker has already worked out what they're going to say. "We had to make some last-minute adjustments. Victor flew in some business partners from Atlanta, major connections, Dad, people that could mean a lot for the firm going forward, and it made more sense to have him up front where he could work the room." He put a hand briefly on my shoulder. "You've got a great view from here." I looked at the pillar that was partially blocking my sight line to the stage. "Sure," I said. It's better for business, you know? I knew you'd understand." He said this with such easy confidence, such complete certainty that I would simply absorb this and nod along, that for a moment I couldn't find any words at all. "You're good with the Hendersons here, right? Great couple. You'll like them." He introduced me to the couple I'd already been sitting beside for 20 minutes. He smiled at me the way you smile at someone you feel mildly guilty about, but not guilty enough to change anything for. And then he moved back toward the center of the room, back toward Victor and the suits and the glow of the stage lights, and I sat back down at table 14 and stared at my water glass. Better for business. I want you to sit with that phrase for a moment, because when your son tells you that the man who gave him a down payment is more important to his business than the man who gave him his entire life, when he says it casually, like it's obvious, like you were foolish for ever assuming otherwise, something happens inside you. It's not like a punch. It's quieter than that. It's more like watching a wall you thought was solid just slowly lean to one side, and you realize the whole time you've been leaning on it, you were the only thing holding it up. I sat at that table for an hour and 40 minutes. I know the exact time because I checked my watch twice. I ate the appetizers that came around, and I smiled at the Hendersons, and I listened to the orchestra play, and I watched my son move through the room like a man who had already sorted everything and everyone into the right order of importance. Victor gave a toast. Of course he did. He stood at the center table and clinked his glass, and the room went quiet, and he spoke for 9 minutes. I counted. About how proud he was of Serena, about how this business venture had grown beyond anyone's expectations, about how the foundation of success was knowing which relationships to invest in. He never mentioned me. Not once. Not a single reference to the man whose retirement savings had been quietly underwriting everything for the past 4 years. Not a name, not a nod, not even the vague acknowledgement of others who helped along the way. I watched Landon listen to that toast and smile and nod, and I thought about the night he called me 3 years ago, the night I was sitting in my kitchen at 11 p.m., and my phone rang, and it was Landon, and he was trying to keep his voice steady, but wasn't quite managing it. He told me about the loan that had fallen through, about the contract they were about to lose, about how if he couldn't find $400,000 in the next 72 hours, the whole thing was going to collapse before it ever really started. I didn't tell him I could help right away. I asked him to send me the numbers. I looked at the numbers. I called my attorney, Marcus Webb, who I'd trusted for 20 years, and I told him what I wanted to do. Marcus told me I was taking a serious risk. I told him I knew that. He drew up the documents the next day. I signed over my entire retirement account, every dollar I had saved in 41 years of working. I guaranteed the loan personally, which meant if Landon's firm failed, I was the one who lost everything. And at Marcus's insistence, strong, repeated, slightly exasperated insistence, I retained controlling interest in the company through a family trust that Landon signed off on without fully understanding what he was signing, because he was panicked and he trusted me, and at that moment he needed me too badly to read the fine print. I paid for this ballroom. I paid for those ice swans. I paid for that toast Victor gave where he stood up and accepted credit for building something that ran, at its foundation, on my money and my risk. And I was at table 14. The orchestra shifted to something slower. Couples moved to the floor. I watched Landon take Serena's hand and lead her out, and she laughed at something he said, and he spun her once, not like a person who knew what they were doing, just a spontaneous happy turn, and she pressed her face against his shoulder. They looked genuinely happy. And I'm telling you this because I need you to understand something. This is the part of the story nobody warned you about. It would have been simpler if my son was miserable, if the money had bought him nothing real. But he looked happy, and Serena looked happy, and the whole beautiful, expensive room was full of people celebrating what appeared to be a genuine success. And I had helped build every inch of it, and I was behind a pillar at table 14, feeling like a man who had been edited out of his own story. I decided to leave somewhere around 9:30. I didn't make an announcement. I didn't find Landon to say goodbye, partly because I wasn't sure I could have the conversation without my voice doing something I'd regret in front of 300 people, and partly because I wasn't entirely sure he'd notice. I thanked the Hendersons. I pushed my chair back. I picked up my jacket from the back of the seat and folded it over my arm. I had just reached the edge of the main floor, nearly to the lobby, when I heard a voice behind me. "Excuse me, I'm sorry to interrupt." I turned around. The man was maybe 40, medium height, carrying a black leather portfolio under one arm and wearing a suit that didn't quite fit the party. Too severe, too functional, more courthouse than ballroom. He was looking directly at me with an expression that was calm but not casual. "Are you Graham Holloway?" he said. "I am." He extended his hand. "My name is Daniel Price. I'm an attorney. I apologize for arriving here this evening, but I've been trying to reach you for several days and was told by your neighbor that you'd be attending this event." He glanced around the ballroom, taking in the crowd, the lights, the orchestra. "There are documents I need to present to you, formal ones, and given the nature of what they address, I was actually instructed by the trust to present them in the presence of all relevant parties." I stared at him. "What trust?" He held up the portfolio. "The Holloway Family Trust, sir." He paused, then said it very quietly, like he wanted to make sure I understood before anyone else did. "The one that controls this company." The orchestra was still playing. People were still dancing. Victor Ashcroft was at the center table laughing his loud laugh at something one of his Atlanta guests had said. I stood very still. "All right," I said. "I do need to ask," Daniel Price said, "that this be presented to the full gathering. The trust documents require it. Every relevant party needs to be present for the formal disclosure." My heart was beating in a strange, slow, deliberate way, like it knew something my brain was still catching up to. I looked back at table 14. I looked at the center table, at Victor's silver head and broad shoulders and that easy, possessing posture of his. I looked at Landon and Serena on the dance floor, still moving to the slow song, still in that small private world of theirs. Then I looked at Daniel Price and his black leather portfolio, and I thought about 41 years of grease-stained hands and a retirement account I had emptied without asking for anything in return. "All right," I said again. "Should I proceed?" I thought about the drive home I'd been planning. Quiet, alone, in my old truck with the bad alternator, telling myself it didn't matter, that I hadn't expected recognition, that this was just how things were. I thought about all the times I had told myself those things, all the drives home I had taken, all the conversations I had swallowed. "Yes," I said. "Go ahead and proceed." Daniel Price nodded once, opened his portfolio, and turned toward the room. What happened next is something I have turned over in my mind almost every day since. Not because of what the documents said. I knew what the documents said. I'd signed every one of them. But because of the look on my son's face when he realized his father had been standing in the back of that room with something to say after all. He stopped dancing. I saw the exact moment he registered the attorney standing there, the moment the portfolio opened, the moment the room began to quiet. I saw Serena's hand slip from his. I saw Victor Ashcroft turn slowly in his seat, champagne glass still in hand, with the beginning of an irritated frown. And then I saw something I hadn't seen on my son's face in a very long time. Fear. Not the fear of a man who has been caught doing something wrong, not exactly, though there was some of that. Something older than that. Something more familiar to me. The look of a man who has just realized, a beat too late, that the ground beneath him is not what he thought it was. I'd been building this ground for 41 years. He'd just forgotten to look down. Daniel Price didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. There's something about a man standing completely still in the middle of a loud room that pulls attention toward him the way a drain pulls water, gradually, then all at once. He walked to the edge of the dance floor, portfolio open in his left hand, and he said clearly and without apology, "I need to request the attention of everyone in this room, please. This will only take a few minutes, but it concerns matters of legal significance that affect every person here tonight." The orchestra trailed off. Not all at once. The violin section kept going for a few extra beats, like they hadn't gotten the message, before the conductor turned and saw what was happening and brought his arms down. The last note hung in the air for a second, then dissolved. 300 people turned to look at a man none of them had invited. I stood where I was, near the edge of the room, and I did not move. My jacket was still folded over my arm. My heart was still doing that slow, deliberate thing. I was aware of my own breathing in a way I normally wasn't. "My apologies for the interruption," Daniel said. He had a voice made for courtrooms, measured, unhurried, carrying without effort. "My name is Daniel Price. I'm an attorney with Webb and Price, attorneys at law here in the city. I represent a legal entity called the Holloway Family Trust." I watched the name land across the room. Most people didn't react. It meant nothing to them. But there were two faces I was watching specifically. Landon had gone very still on the dance floor. Serena stood slightly behind him, one hand still resting on his forearm, her expression shifting from confused to alert in real time. And Victor at the center table had set down his champagne glass. He was frowning the way powerful men frown when something unexpected inserts itself into their evening. Not with fear, not yet, but with the particular offense of a man who does not enjoy being surprised. "What is this?" Victor said. He said it loudly enough to carry, not asking the attorney exactly, but the room generally, as if the room owed him an explanation. Daniel looked at him calmly. "I'll explain everything, Mr. Ashcroft. I'd ask for your patience for just a few minutes." Victor's eyes narrowed. He was not accustomed to being asked to wait. Landon was moving now, crossing the floor toward Daniel with his shoulders squared, and his expression arranged into something that was trying to be authoritative but was fraying at the edges. "Hey, can we take this somewhere private? This isn't the time for—" "I understand this is inconvenient," Daniel said, "but the trust documents I'm presenting this evening specifically require that disclosure be made in the presence of all relevant parties. That requirement is legally binding, not discretionary." He turned slightly so that his voice addressed the wider room again. "I want to assure everyone that I'll be brief and that I'm not here to disrupt your evening any longer than necessary." Landon stopped walking. He was about 6 feet from Daniel now. I could see his jaw working, the way it always did when he was trying to find the right thing to say and coming up short. Dad? He turned his head and looked at me across the room. Did you arrange this? Every face in the room followed the direction of his gaze. 300 people looked at the man in the charcoal suit standing by the wall near the lobby entrance. The man from table 14. I met my son's eyes. I didn't answer right away. I let the silence sit there between us for a moment, which I'll admit I did on purpose, and I'm not entirely sorry about it. No, I said, I didn't arrange it, but I'm not stopping it either. Something flickered across Landon's face that I couldn't fully name. It wasn't quite anger. It was more like the expression of a man who is beginning to understand very quickly that he has miscalculated something in a significant way. Mr. Holloway, Daniel Price turned to me. Would you like to come forward, sir? I walked across that ballroom. I want you to understand what that felt like. Walking from the corner where I'd been stored for the evening, past the pillar, past table 14, through 300 people who had been laughing and dancing 30 seconds ago and were now absolutely silent. My shoes made sounds on the floor that I could actually hear. I passed the center table, past Victor Ashcroft, who tracked me with those narrowed eyes, and I stopped beside Daniel Price, and I stood there. This was the same room where, 2 hours earlier, I had been handed a seat behind a pillar and told it was better for business. Thank you, Daniel said quietly, just to me. Then, to the room. As I mentioned, I represent the Holloway Family Trust. The trust was established 4 years ago by Mr. Graham Holloway, this gentleman here, for the purpose of providing financial backing to the business venture now known as Holloway Ashcroft Consulting Group. He let that hang for just a second. I'm going to briefly outline what the trust contains because it has direct bearing on the ownership structure of this company, a structure that I have reason to believe has not been clearly understood by all parties involved. Hold on. Victor was on his feet. He was a large man and he used his size the way large men who are used to authority sometimes do, planting himself like a fact. I don't know what you think you're doing, but this is a private event. Whatever business you have with Graham, it can be handled through proper channels during business hours. You don't walk into someone's anniversary party and start making declarations. You're absolutely right that this is unusual, Daniel said, and I would have preferred a different setting. But when I explain the contents of these documents, Mr. Ashcroft, I think you'll understand why the trust required this form of disclosure. The trust required it, Victor repeated slowly, with the tone of a man who has spent decades being the one who sets requirements for other people. Yes, sir. And who set up this trust? Mr. Graham Holloway. Victor looked at me then, really looked at me, maybe for the first time that evening, and I could see him doing what men like Victor always do. Rapid assessment, categorization, placement on a hierarchy. He saw the old suit, the rough hands, the retirement age, the table 14. He did not look concerned. That was the honest truth of it. He looked at me and he was not yet concerned because men like Victor do not worry about men like me. That's the thing about a certain kind of privilege. It makes you genuinely, almost innocently, unable to imagine the ground shifting under your feet. That would change. Dad, please, Landon's voice had dropped. He moved toward me, close enough that he didn't have to project. Whatever this is about, whatever you're upset about tonight, I get it, okay? I hear you. But this isn't the way. You're going to embarrass yourself in front of what, Landon? He stopped. In front of 300 people who don't know me, I said. My voice was even. I surprised myself with how even it was. In front of Victor's business partners from Atlanta? In front of the people I helped put in this room? I looked at my son. Really looked at him, the way I hadn't quite let myself do all evening. You already handled that part, son. You put me behind a pillar 2 hours ago. I don't think I have much dignity left to protect in this room. Landon's mouth opened. Then it closed. Serena, standing just behind him, put her hand over her mouth. Mr. Holloway, Daniel said gently, do you want to proceed? I turned back to him. Yes. He opened the portfolio fully and removed a set of documents, bound, tabbed, formal-looking in the way that things are formal when they've been prepared by people who are very good at making things legal and permanent. 4 years ago, Daniel began, when Holloway Ashcroft Consulting Group was in its early stages and facing a significant liquidity crisis, Mr. Graham Holloway liquidated his full retirement savings, a total of $412,000, and guaranteed an additional bank loan of $250,000 using his personal assets as collateral. He paused, and I could hear the numbers moving through the room. I could see Victor Ashcroft's expression shift, just slightly, from dismissal towards something more careful. These contributions were made through the Holloway Family Trust, which retained a controlling ownership interest of 51% in the consulting group. This arrangement was formalized with the full knowledge and signature of Mr. Landon Holloway. The room was very quiet, the kind of quiet that feels heavy. Now, Daniel continued, his voice staying level, I understand that for some in this room, the public narrative around this company has emphasized a different source of financial foundation. That's not my concern this evening. My concern is the legal record, which is unambiguous. He held up the top document. The Holloway Family Trust is the majority controlling entity of this business. Mr. Graham Holloway has final authority over major financial and structural decisions. That has been the legal reality since the trust was established. Victor sat back down. It wasn't a graceful thing. It was the movement of a man whose legs have decided they're not sure about standing anymore. He sat down and he looked at the documents in Daniel's hand, and for the first time that evening, he didn't look like a man surveying land he owned. He looked like a man who was recalculating how much land had ever really been his. That's not... He stopped, started again. Landon, what is this? Landon's face had gone a shade of pale that I recognized from when he was a child, the particular color he turned when he'd done something he couldn't undo. He was looking at the documents. I could see his mind working, going back to that night 4 years ago, the panicked phone call, the numbers I'd asked him to send over, the attorney's visit he'd barely paid attention to because he was too terrified about losing everything to read carefully what he was signing. I signed, he started, he cleared his throat. I signed papers with Dad's attorney about the loan. I didn't realize you didn't read them, Daniel said, not unkindly. That's not unusual. People under financial duress often don't read documents as carefully as they should, but the signature is valid, the trust is valid, the ownership structure is valid. He looked at Victor. And that means, Mr. Ashcroft, that your understanding of your family's controlling interest in this company is not supported by the legal record. Somewhere at a table near the back, a chair scraped against the floor. Someone coughed. The Atlanta business partners were doing that thing people do when they're witnessing something they weren't supposed to see, trying to take up less space, trying to become temporarily invisible. Victor stood again. This time it was different. Not the casual authority of before, but something harder, something with an edge. Graham. He said my name like it cost him something to use it. Whatever grievance you have about tonight, whatever misunderstanding about seating arrangements, we can discuss that privately. I'm sure Landon would agree that... Victor. I said his name back to him with the same weight. I don't have a grievance about a seating arrangement. He blinked. I have a 41-year record of showing up, I said, quietly, without cameras or speeches or guests from Atlanta. I have a retirement account I emptied, and a loan I guaranteed, and a company I funded because my son called me at 11 o'clock at night, and he needed help, and I helped him. I stopped, because I could feel something in my chest that I did not want to let fully through in a room full of strangers. I waited a beat. I wasn't looking for a standing ovation. I wasn't looking for a toast. I would have been satisfied with a table that wasn't behind a pillar. The silence that followed that was different from the earlier silence. That one had been shock. This one had weight. The kind of weight that comes when a room full of people who have been performing all evening suddenly stops performing. Serena made a sound. Not words, just a sound, quiet and involuntary, the kind that escapes before you can decide whether to let it out. I glanced at her. Her eyes were wet. She was looking at me with an expression that I think was shame, though I couldn't be entirely sure it wasn't just the lighting. Landon had his hand pressed flat against the back of a chair. He was staring at the floor. Dad, he said. Just that. Just the word, but with a texture to it I hadn't heard in a long time. Not the managed Landon of the past few years, not the businessman Landon, or the status-conscious Landon. Something younger than that. something that remembered who I was to him before all this had happened and covered everything over. I looked at my son. There was a part of me, the part that had driven to this party alone, that had pressed my old suit and polished my shoes, that had wanted nothing more complicated than to sit near the front and watch my boy be happy. That part of me wanted to go to him right then, to put my hand on his arm and say it was all right. But it wasn't all right. And telling him it was would have been the kindest lie I could have offered him, and I'd spent enough of my life being kind in ways that cost me too much. Daniel Price closed the portfolio. "I want to be clear," he said, returning to his attorney's register, "that no immediate action is being taken tonight. The trust is not being dissolved. Operations will continue as normal. Mr. Holloway simply felt that, given this evening's events, the full picture should be on the table." He looked briefly at me, a look that said, in its quietness, that he understood what this evening's events had been. "Formal meetings with all stakeholders will be scheduled through our office this week. All parties will have the opportunity to review the documents in full." Victor Ashcroft was still on his feet. The confidence had not fully left him. Men like Victor don't empty out all at once. But it had changed shape. It had become something defensive, something that was looking for a foothold. His eyes moved around the room, checking the faces of his Atlanta guests, performing a rapid damage assessment. "This was calculated," he said. "Not to Daniel, to me. This whole thing, showing up with a lawyer at a family event, this was deliberate." "Was it calculated?" I asked him, "or was it just the truth arriving at an inconvenient time?" He had no answer for that. Or he had one, but he was smart enough not to use it in front of 300 witnesses. I turned to Daniel. "Thank you, Mr. Price. I think that's enough for tonight." Daniel nodded, tucked the portfolio under his arm, and walked quietly toward the exit with the manner of a man who has done exactly what he came to do and requires nothing further from the situation. I stood alone in the center of the room where I had spent the evening belonging to its edges. The orchestra had not started back up. The servers with their silver trays had stopped moving. 300 people were looking at me, and I am not exaggerating when I tell you that I had absolutely no idea what to do with that, because I had never in my life been the center of anything, and I was 67 years old, and it was a lot. So I did what I know how to do. I picked up my jacket, which had somehow ended up draped over the back of the nearest chair, and I put it on. I straightened the collar. I looked at Landon one more time across the length of that room. He was looking back at me with his mother's eyes and my jaw, and an expression I was going to have to spend a long time thinking about before I understood all of what was in it. "I was going to go home," I said to him across the distance. "I was going to just go home." And I walked out. The cool October air hit me when I pushed through the lobby doors, and I stood outside the Ashcroft Grand Ballroom with my breath visible and my truck 3 rows back in the parking lot and the sound of my own heartbeat finally starting to slow down. Behind me, through the glass doors, I could see the light of the ballroom. I could not hear anything, but after a moment I saw movement, people beginning to talk to each other in small clusters, the dam of silence breaking, the way it always does when something has happened that people will be discussing for months. I found my truck. I got in. I sat there for a minute with the keys in my hand and didn't start it right away. The alternator light was going to come on in about 6 miles. It always did at the 40-minute mark once the battery had been running long enough. I'd been meaning to fix it. I hadn't gotten around to it. I started the truck and pulled out of the parking lot, and I drove home through the cool October dark, and I did not cry. But there were about 4 miles where it was a near thing. What I didn't know yet, what I couldn't have known as I drove home that night thinking it was finally exhaustedly over, was that the real reckoning hadn't happened yet. Victor Ashcroft was not the kind of man who absorbs a blow in public and goes quietly home. And Landon, my son, my boy, with his mother's eyes, was standing in that ballroom right now, making a decision about who he was and what he was willing to do about it. I would find out which way he landed soon enough. I didn't sleep that night. I don't mean I slept badly or woke up a few times. I mean I lay in my bed in the dark with the ceiling above me and my hands at my sides and my eyes open, and the hours moved past me like traffic I was watching from a window. At some point around 2 in the morning, I got up and made coffee in my percolator and sat at the kitchen table where I had sat 10,000 times before, and I looked at the phone and I waited to see if it would ring. It didn't. Not that night. I thought about Landon standing on that dance floor with his hand flat against the back of a chair. I thought about the color that had drained from his face when Daniel read those numbers aloud. $412,000, $250,000 more. And I tried to figure out what I was feeling about it. I expected to feel something clean, relief maybe, or the particular satisfaction of a wrong being acknowledged. But what I actually felt was messier than that, closer to grief than victory. The kind of tired that doesn't come from a bad night's sleep, but from years of something. My phone rang at 7:14 in the morning. I was still at the kitchen table. It was Landon. I let it ring twice before I picked up. Not out of strategy. I just needed those 2 extra seconds to decide what voice I was going to answer with. In the end, I just answered with my own. "Hey," I said. There was a pause on his end. I could hear him breathing. "Hey, Dad." Neither of us said anything for a moment. Outside my kitchen window, a bird was doing something repetitive in the oak tree. The percolator was ticking as it cooled. "I need to come over," Landon said. "Can I come over?" "It's your call," I said. He arrived 40 minutes later. He was still wearing clothes from the night before. Dress shirt untucked, jacket gone, the kind of dishevelment that said he hadn't slept either. He looked like a man who had spent the night in an argument or inside one, which I supposed amounted to the same thing. His eyes were red at the rims, not from crying, I thought, from the particular strain of a very long, very difficult conversation that had gone on past midnight with his wife or his father-in-law, or both. I let him in. I poured him coffee without asking. We sat across from each other at the kitchen table, and he held his mug in both hands the way he used to as a kid when he was cold or frightened, and I waited. "Victor is furious," he said finally. "I expect he is. He's talking about having the trust documents challenged. He's got his own attorneys looking at it." Landon set the mug down. "He says you blindsided the family. He says what you did last night was an act of—" His word was aggression. I looked at my son. "He said that." "Yeah. The man who took my seat accepted credit for funding your company for 4 years and never once told those 300 people that a single dollar of mine was involved in any of it." I stopped, took a breath. He called what I did aggression. Landon had the grace not to defend it. He looked at his coffee. "I'm not here to take his side," he said. "I want you to know that." "Then what side are you here to take?" He looked up at me. That question landed hard and he knew it. I could see it land. He didn't have an answer ready, which told me something because Landon always had an answer ready. He was his mother's son in that way, quick with words, quick to frame a thing. The fact that he was sitting across from me with nothing prepared meant that for once he was trying to say something real instead of something effective. "I've been thinking about the money," he said slowly, "about what you actually did. I knew you helped. I knew that. But I didn't—" He stopped, pressed his lips together. I didn't let myself think too hard about the scale of it. I think because if I thought about it clearly, I'd have had to sit with what it meant, what it cost you. "Your entire retirement," I said, not to wound him, just because it was the fact. "I know." His voice had gone quiet. "I know, Dad. I'm not telling you that so you feel terrible about it. I made that decision. I'd make it again, but I need you to understand that when I walked into that room last night and saw Victor in that chair, your mother's chair, the chair Serena told me was mine, and then you explained it by saying it was better for business, I had to stop again. That wasn't a seating chart mix-up, Landon. That was a message. And the message was that I have been sorted into a category that doesn't require the front table." He was quiet for a long time. The bird in the oak tree had stopped. "Serena cried last night," he said finally. "Not about the party or about Victor or the documents. About you. She said she didn't know. About the retirement account. She said nobody told her the full picture." He looked at me with something that was not quite an accusation and not quite a question. "Did you tell her not to be told?" "I told Marcus to keep the trust documentation private. That was my choice." "Why?" "Because I didn't want your wife to feel obligated to me," I said. "I didn't want every dinner, every birthday, every time Serena looked at me to have this financial thing underneath it making everything awkward. I wanted to help my son because he needed help, not because I wanted leverage. Landon stared at me. Something was happening in his face that I found difficult to watch. The specific expression of a grown man realizing in real time that he has fundamentally misread someone he should have known perfectly. "So you protected us," he said, "from even knowing what you'd done." I kept it simple. And then last night I watched a man who has been taking credit for my life savings stand up in front of 300 people and accept a toast, I said. And I watched my son put me behind a pillar so the room would look right. And I decided that simple had lasted long enough. Landon put his elbows on the table and pressed his face into his hands. He stayed like that for a while. I didn't try to fill the silence. I'd spent too many years filling silences that needed to be left empty. When he came back up, his eyes were wet. He didn't try to hide it, which I gave him credit for. "I don't know how to fix this," he said. "I know you don't," I said. "That's honest, at least." "I'm not asking you to pretend it's fine. I'm just—" He shook his head. "I don't know where to start." "You start by not asking me to make it easy for you," I said. "Because that's what you're doing right now, even if you don't know it. You came over here and you're being genuine, and I appreciate that. But somewhere in this conversation, you're hoping I'll say, 'It's okay,' and send you home lighter than you arrived. And I'm not going to do that. Not because I want to punish you, because it wouldn't be the truth." He nodded. Once, slowly, like a man accepting a condition he doesn't have the standing to argue with. The harder conversation came 2 days later, and it wasn't with Landon. Victor called me directly. Not through Landon, not through an attorney. He called my cell phone at 10 in the morning like he was calling a contractor about an estimate. I had a feeling he was going to do this. Men like Victor prefer to handle things personally, one-on-one, in settings they believe they can control. A phone call is a controlled setting. He could calculate his words, manage his tone, never have to let me see his face. "Graham," he said, same as at the party, like the name cost him. "Victor. I'd like to speak plainly, if that's all right with you." "Go ahead." "What you did Saturday night was destructive. You know that. You walked into your son's anniversary party, and you publicly ambushed his family with legal documents, and you humiliated everyone in that room who had any association with Serena or with me." His voice was controlled, but I could hear the shape of the anger underneath it, the way you can hear machinery running on the other side of a wall. "Whatever your grievance, that was not the way to handle it." "I heard you make this argument Saturday night," I said. "I don't think you've added anything new." A pause. "I'm prepared to discuss compensation for your investment. A structured buyout of whatever interest the trust claims, handled quietly, handled professionally, with full legal review. You get your money back, you get a fair return on it, and we move forward without a court case that benefits nobody." I let that sit there for a second. "Victor," I said, "I didn't retain that trust interest because I wanted money. I have enough money. Marcus insisted on the structure for legal protection, and I agreed to it, but it was never about ownership." "Then what?" "It was about my son," I said. "That's all it was ever about. My son called me at 11 at night and he needed help, and I helped him. Same as I've been doing since he was 3 years old." I moved to the window. The oak tree was out there, bare-limbed now in the October light. What I didn't account for was that you would spend the following 4 years convincing him and yourself, and apparently 300 party guests, that the foundation under his success had your name on it. "I contributed significantly." "You contributed," I said. "That's true. I'm not taking that away from you. But you contributed money that was easy for you to give. I contributed money that was everything I had." I paused. "Those aren't the same thing, Victor. You understand that difference, I think. You're too smart not to." Silence on his end, a different kind of silence than before. "What do you want?" he asked. And this time the control in his voice had thinned enough that I could hear something more human underneath it. Not remorse. I don't think Victor was built for remorse exactly. But something. Calculation rerunning itself. A man who has spent his whole life knowing the price of things, trying to figure out what the price of this was. "I want my son to know who he is," I said. "And I want him to know who I am. That's it. That's the whole list." Another long pause. Then, And the trust? I'll be meeting with Marcus and Daniel later this week about the trust. Whatever happens with it, that's between me and the attorneys. But I'll tell you this much. I'm not interested in using it as a weapon. I never was. He hung up without saying goodbye, which was fine. I wasn't looking for his farewell. The meeting with Marcus and Daniel happened on Thursday morning in Marcus's office downtown, a place I'd been going to for 20 years, with the same bad coffee in the waiting room and the same view of the parking structure from the window. Marcus was 71 and had been my attorney since I was dealing with the paperwork around the shop, and he had the kind of face that had seen enough of life's complications to stay calm in the face of most of them. He was calm that morning, but he was also watching me carefully in the way he did when he wanted to make sure I was thinking clearly. Victor's attorneys have reviewed the trust documents, he said, setting a folder on the desk between us. Their position is that Landon's signature was given under duress and without full understanding of the terms, and they intend to argue that the controlling interest clause should be voided. Can they win that? I asked. They can try. It would be a difficult argument. Landon was not under any external coercion. His financial situation was stressful, but he was a competent adult who retained the right to seek independent counsel before signing, which he chose not to do. Marcus folded his hands on the desk. In my opinion, a challenge fails. But it takes time, and it takes money, and it takes your family sitting across from each other in a courtroom. I looked at the folder. I don't want a courtroom. I know you don't. So tell me what I do want, I said, because that's what I'd been paying Marcus for over 20 years, to help me figure out what I actually wanted when the situation got complicated enough that I couldn't see it clearly on my own. Marcus picked up his pen. You want to stop being the silent backbone of something you built. You want Landon to genuinely run this company, not with Victor's hand in the machinery, not with a father's money propping the foundation invisibly. You want it to stand on its own. He set the pen down. And you want out of the structure that made you invisible without destroying what you put into it. I nodded. Then here's what I'd recommend, Marcus said. And he told me. What he laid out was not revenge. It was not a hostile takeover or a public humiliation or any of the things Victor's attorneys were probably bracing for. It was something quieter, and I think more devastating in its own way. Because it was fair. It was entirely, unimpeachably fair. And fairness is the one thing that people who've been benefiting from unfairness find most difficult to argue against. I listened to every word Marcus said. When he finished, I sat with it for a moment. Outside the window, the parking structure was gray and ordinary in the morning light, the same as it always was. The same as it had been every time I'd sat in this office and tried to figure out how to handle something my life had handed me that I hadn't planned for. Will Landon fight it? I asked. Marcus considered that. Landon is not his father-in-law, he said carefully. I think Landon, given time to understand what this means, what it really means, not the surface version, will make the right choice. And if he doesn't? Marcus looked at me over the top of his glasses with the particular patience of a man who has known you long enough to tell you the truth without softening it. Then you'll know, he said simply, what this family is actually made of. I drove home from that meeting with Marcus's plan sitting in my chest alongside everything else I'd been carrying that week. It was a heavy load. I won't pretend it wasn't. I was 67 years old and I was tired, the real kind of tired, and there were moments in those days when I wondered whether I had done the right thing. Not just Saturday night, but all of it. The retirement account, the silence, the years of contributing without insisting on being seen. I didn't have a clean answer to that. I still don't, if I'm being honest with you. I'm not the kind of man who gets to the end of a hard story and finds everything resolved into a lesson he's at peace with. Life doesn't move that way. Not in my experience. Things are messier than that, and anyone who tells you otherwise is either lying or selling something. What I knew was this. I had spent 41 years building things, engines, relationships, a family, a business I'd never taken public credit for. And I was done being the foundation that nobody mentioned when they described the building. What happened next with Landon, what he chose when Marcus's plan was set in front of him, when the real choice between his father and his father-in-law was finally, unavoidably, on the table. That was going to tell me everything. and I was not at all sure I was ready to hear it. Marcus's plan was on the table by Friday morning. I want to be precise about what that means, because I think people hear legal plan and they imagine something cold and mechanical, a set of maneuvers designed to hurt someone, to win something, to take. That's not what Marcus put together. What he drafted was a restructuring proposal, a transition of trustee authority, a clean, documented, professionally executed transfer of operational control from the Holloway Family Trust to an independent three-person board, people with no family ties, no financial allegiances to either Ashcroft money or Holloway money, just competent professionals whose only job would be to run the company well. My role as silent, controlling trustee would end. Victor's informal influence, the kind that doesn't show up in documents but shapes every decision in a room, would be formally excluded from the governance structure. And Landon would remain as CEO, with real authority for the first time, but answerable to a board rather than to the invisible architecture of family money that had been propping him up, and without anyone fully meaning it to, slowly hollowing him out. Marcus sent the proposal to Landon's personal email on Friday at 9 in the morning. He sent a copy to Victor's attorneys at the same time. He did not send it to Serena because Serena was not a named party in the trust. That turned out to matter. I know what happened next because Landon told me later, not all at once, but in pieces, over several conversations, the way a person tells a story when they're still figuring out how to live with their own part in it. He read the email at his desk. He read it twice. Then he printed it out and read it a third time with a pen in his hand, which was how he processed things he needed to fully understand. Always had been, even as a kid doing homework at this same kitchen table. He said he sat with it for almost an hour before he called anyone. He called Serena first, not Victor. That was the first thing that told me something had shifted in him, even if I didn't know it at the time. Victor found out from his attorneys at approximately 10:30. I know this because Victor called me at 10:37. I was in my garage doing what I do when I need to think, which is work on something with my hands. I was adjusting the timing on a neighbor's truck I'd offered to look at, and my phone was on the workbench, and when it lit up with Victor's name, I set down the wrench and wiped my hands on a rag and picked it up. "You went ahead with it," Victor said. "No greeting, no preamble." "I did." "You're removing yourself as trustee." "I am. And installing a board that I have no relationship with and no influence over." "That's the idea," I said. "Graham." His voice had a different quality than it had during our earlier call. That one had been strategic, controlled anger deployed like a tool. This one was more unguarded, more like a man who has just understood the shape of something and doesn't like the shape at all. "Do you understand what you're doing to this company? The relationships I've built? The clients, the referral networks, the partnerships, those exist because of my name and my connections. You dismantle my involvement and you destabilize everything." "Or," I said, "you've built a company on a foundation of personal loyalty to you, which means the company was never really standing on its own." Silence. "Landon needs me," Victor said. "Landon needed me," I said, 4 years ago, and I was there. What he needs now is to find out what he's capable of when nobody's money is doing his standing for him, including mine." Another silence, longer this time. Then, "This is about Saturday night. This is still about a chair at a party." "Victor." I set the phone against my shoulder for a second and looked at the ceiling of my garage, the water stain near the far corner that I'd been meaning to address for 2 years, the pegboard where my tools hang in the same order they've hung for 30 years. Then I put the phone back to my ear. "If you genuinely believe this is about a chair, then you and I have a more fundamental problem than the trust documents." He didn't say anything. "It was never about the chair," I said. "It was about what the chair represented. It was about watching you accept credit for something you didn't build, in a room full of people, while my son watched and said nothing. It was about realizing that I had made myself so invisible, for so long, that the invisibility had become permanent. That nobody in that room, not the guests, not the business partners, not my own son, thought to ask where the money actually came from." I paused. "I made myself invisible to protect my family, Victor, not to hand you a gift." More silence. Then, quietly, "And I'll give him this, It was the most honest thing I ever heard Victor Ashcroft say. What happens to Serena in all this? Not what happens to me. Not what happens to my influence or my business connections. What happens to his daughter? Serena's fine, I said. She was always fine. This company is solid. The restructuring protects it. The board will manage it better than either of our interference has. I let that sit for a second. Serena married a good man who got confused about where his loyalty belonged for a while. He'll find his way back. That's my opinion. Victor didn't respond to that. A few seconds later, the call ended. The formal meeting to execute the restructuring was scheduled for the following Tuesday at Marcus's office. All relevant parties: Landon, his attorney, Victor's attorneys, Marcus, Daniel Price, and me. I didn't sleep well the Sunday before it. I'm telling you that because I want you to understand that none of this felt triumphant from the inside. People imagine that when you finally draw a line, when you finally stop swallowing things and let the truth sit in the room, it feels like power. Sometimes it does. But mostly, in my experience, it just feels like a door closing. And you stand on one side of it, and you're not entirely sure what's on the other side. And you have to live with that uncertainty. And it's not clean, and it's not easy, and anyone who tells you it is has never actually had to do it. Landon called me Sunday night, late, after 10. I was on the couch with the television on but not watching it, which is the old man's version of staring at the ceiling. Dad. Hey. I wanted to talk before tomorrow. He paused. Can I talk for a minute without you having to respond to everything? Go ahead. He was quiet for a second, finding the beginning. Then, I've been thinking about the night I called you, the 11 o'clock call. I remember sitting at my kitchen table. This was before we moved to the house. We were still in the apartment on Mercer, and I had my laptop open, and the numbers were they were bad, Dad. They were really bad. And I sat there for a long time before I called you because I was ashamed. I was so ashamed. I'd been telling everyone the business was solid, and it wasn't, and I didn't know what I was going to do. I listened. The television was on mute. Outside my window, the street was quiet. And you answered on the first ring, Landon said. You always answer on the first ring. I don't think I ever noticed that before, but you always do. Another pause. You didn't make me explain myself for very long. You just asked for the numbers. And then you said you'd look at them and you'd call me back. And I remember hanging up and thinking, I don't know what I was thinking exactly, but I felt less alone than I had in weeks. He stopped. I think I knew you were going to help me, but I didn't let myself think about what it actually cost you to do it, because if I had, I would have had to feel something about it, and I had too much going on to feel something about it. Landon, I'm not done, he said quietly. I said, give me a minute. Okay. I let Victor take up a lot of space, he said, in the business, in how we made decisions, in how I thought about things. I told myself it was smart, you know? He had connections. He had experience. He knew how rooms worked. And there was this part of me that I think I liked how he talked about the business. Like it was this big important thing, like I was the man behind a real empire. His voice shifted, got quieter. With you, it was different. With you, it was always, you were proud of me, but it was a quiet kind of proud. Like you didn't need to perform it. And I think I confused that quietness with, I don't know, with not caring as much, which is stupid, I said. A small sound that might have been a laugh. Yeah, stupid. Your mother was the same kind of quiet, I said. Didn't mean she loved you less. He didn't say anything for a moment. When he came back, his voice was different. Rougher around the edges, less controlled. I know, he said. I know that. We sat on the phone in silence for a little while. The kind of silence that has texture to it, the kind that means something. What do you want from tomorrow? He asked finally. I want you to sign the restructuring agreement, I said, and I want you to mean it. Not because your attorneys told you it was the path of least resistance, but because you actually understand why it matters that this company stands on its own. And Victor? Victor's relationship with you and Serena is your business, I said. He's her father. I'm not asking you to throw him out of your life. I'm asking you to stop letting him run yours. Another long pause. He's not going to take this quietly. I know. He might pull some of the client relationships. There are 3 accounts that came entirely through his network. If he decides to poison those, the first quarter is going to hurt. Yes, I said. It might. You're not worried about that? Landon. I sat forward on the couch. A business that can only survive because your father-in-law is making friendly phone calls on your behalf is not a business. It's a favor, and favors run out. I paused. You're good at this work. I've watched you for 4 years and you're genuinely good at it, but you haven't had to be good enough yet because there's always been a safety net made of other people's money and other people's names. Tomorrow we take the net down, and I know that's frightening, but I believe you can do it. Silence on his end, longer than the others. Do you actually believe that? He asked. Or are you saying it because you're my father? Both, I said. Those aren't different things. He let out a breath. Long, slow, the kind that carries something with it when it goes. Okay, he said. Okay? I'll sign it, and I'll mean it. Tuesday morning arrived gray and cold, the kind of November morning that doesn't pretend to be anything cheerful. I put on the charcoal suit again, not out of symbolism, just because it was my good suit and this was a formal meeting. And I drove to Marcus's office with the alternator light coming on at the 40-minute mark exactly as it always did, and I sat in the parking structure for a minute before I went up, just sitting with the engine running and the light blinking amber on the dash. Victor's attorneys were already there when I arrived, 2 men from a firm downtown, both younger than me, both with the polished defensive alertness of lawyers who'd been briefed to expect an adversarial environment. They nodded at me when I came in and I nodded back. Marcus was at the head of the table. Daniel Price was beside him. Landon arrived 4 minutes after me, alone. No attorney, which surprised me. And he sat down across from me and met my eyes and held them for a second, and I gave him a small nod, and he gave me one back. Victor did not come. He sent his attorneys. That told me something about what he'd decided, which was that this battle was already over, and he knew it. The meeting took 2 hours and 11 minutes. There were documents to review, amendments to initial, signatures to collect. Victor's attorneys raised 3 formal objections, all of which Marcus addressed with the particular calm of a man who had prepared for every argument and found them insufficient. Landon's hand was steady when he signed. I watched it and I noted the steadiness, and I thought about the 11 o'clock phone call 4 years ago when his voice had been anything but. When it was done, Marcus gathered the papers and Daniel made copies, and the 2 outside attorneys packed their briefcases with the resigned efficiency of people who have lost something they knew they were going to lose. They left without ceremony. And then it was just me and Landon and Marcus in that office, with the bad coffee and the parking structure out the window. Marcus said he'd give us a minute and stepped out, which was why I'd trusted him for 20 years. Landon and I sat across from each other at the empty table. The documents were signed. The trust was restructuring. The board would be named by the end of the week. And whatever came next, the harder quarter, Victor's cooling on certain relationships, the work of running a company without a safety net, that was Landon's now. His and Serena's. The way it should have been from the beginning if I'd been less afraid of watching him fall. How do you feel? Landon asked. I thought about that honestly. Tired, I said. He almost smiled. Me too. But okay, I added. I feel okay. He nodded. He was looking at the table, then he looked up at me. I'm going to fix the first quarter, he said. I know that sounds like a line right now, but I'm going to. I know you are, I said. Don't tell me about it. Just do it. He nodded again. I stood up, put on my jacket, picked up my keys from the table where I'd set them. And then, because I am his father, and I am not made of stone and I have been a lot of things in my life, but I'm not capable of sitting across from my son at a turning point in both our lives and walking out without acknowledging it. I put my hand on his shoulder, just briefly, just for a moment. He put his hand over mine. We didn't say anything. We didn't have to. I walked out of Marcus's office and down the elevator and through the lobby and out into the gray November morning, and I stood on the sidewalk for a second with my keys in my hand and the cold air on my face. The hardest part, it turned out, wasn't the party or the trust or Victor's phone calls or even the documents. The hardest part was this, knowing that I had done the right thing and having absolutely no guarantee that it would be enough. That Landon would rise to it. That the business would hold. That my son, who I loved with the specific and complicated love of a father who has watched a child become someone both familiar and strange, would come out the other side of this better than he went in. I had no guarantee of any of it. What I had was what I'd always had. The same thing that got me through 41 years in a shop and 6 years without Ellen and a retirement account I'd emptied at 63 years old without telling a soul. The belief that doing the right thing matters, even when you can't see where it lands. I got in my truck. The alternator light would come on in 40 minutes. I drove home. I need to back up before I go forward because there's something I left out of the previous months that I need to tell you now. In early February, about 3 weeks after the restructuring was signed and the board was being assembled and everyone was still figuring out what the new normal looked like, I got a call from a number I didn't recognize. I almost didn't answer it. I was under the truck at the time. I had finally decided to fix the alternator myself rather than keep driving around with that amber light blinking at me like a slow accusation, and my phone was on the concrete beside my left knee, and I had grease up to my elbows, and I almost let it go to voicemail. Something made me answer. The voice on the other end was a woman's, measured, professional, slightly careful in the way people are careful when they're about to say something they've thought about more than once. Is this Graham Holloway? It is. Mr. Holloway, my name is Patricia Lennon. I'm a journalist with the Meridian Business Review. I've been looking into the restructuring of Holloway Ashcroft Consulting Group, and I was hoping you'd be willing to speak with me about your role in the company's financial history. I lay there under the truck for a second, looking up at the undercarriage. How did you hear about the restructuring? I asked. That's a little complicated to explain over the phone, she said. But I've spoken with several people who were present at the Ashcroft Grand Ballroom in October, and I've reviewed some publicly available legal filings from the trust transition. A pause. There's a story here, Mr. Holloway, about how the company was actually built. I think it's one people should hear. I thought about 300 people in a ballroom. I thought about Victor's Atlanta business partners who had been sitting very quietly during Daniel Price's disclosure. I thought about how news moves through rooms, through phone calls, through the particular social network of people who know people who know people. I appreciate you reaching out, I said, but I'm not interested in a story. A beat of silence. May I ask why? Because my son is running a business, I said, and he doesn't need his father's grievances turning into a news cycle. Whatever happened between my family and me, it's been addressed. The legal structure is sound. The company is moving forward. With respect, Mr. Holloway, you contributed over $650,000 of personal assets to a company that publicly credited another man for its financial foundation. That's not just a family matter. It's exactly a family matter, I said, and I handled it like one. She was quiet for a moment. Victor Ashcroft has spent considerable time cultivating a public narrative around his family's business interests. Some people might say the public record deserves correction. Some people might say that, I agreed. I'm not one of them. Victor and I know the truth. My son knows the truth. The board knows the truth. The people who matter know. And the people who don't matter? I pulled myself out from under the truck and sat up on the cold garage floor with the phone against my ear. Miss Lennon, I have spent the better part of 2 years being invisible inside my own family. I am not going to trade that for being visible in a newspaper. That's not the kind of scene I'm looking for. She didn't call back after that. Maybe she found a different angle. Maybe there wasn't enough story without my participation to make it worth printing. Either way, nothing ran. And I didn't tell Landon about the call, not then. He had enough to manage, and I wasn't going to hand him something else to worry about. I told him about it later, in March, when the first quarter numbers were in and things had stabilized enough that it was just a piece of information rather than a potential crisis. He looked at me for a long moment when I told him. You could have let her run it, he said. Victor deserved a lot of things, I said. So did you, and so did I. Keeping score of what people deserve is a full-time job, and I'm retired. He almost laughed. Not quite, but almost. I'm telling you this now because I want you to understand something about the choices I made through all of this. None of them were about winning. Not the attorney at the party, not the restructuring, not turning down a journalist who was offering me the chance to set the public record straight. Every choice I made was about something quieter than winning. It was about reclaiming something that doesn't have a name exactly, the sense that you exist in your own story, that you are not a footnote in someone else's account of events, that your life and what you've given and what it cost you is real whether or not anyone writes it down. I had given my son a company and hidden the fact of the giving so completely that the giving had been erased. That was my mistake as much as anyone else's. And fixing it didn't require a newspaper. It required a conversation. Several conversations. The slow, imperfect, non-linear process of two people who love each other trying to find their way back to something honest. That process was still happening in April when Landon invited me to dinner. It was still happening at that crooked candled table with Serena's slightly overcooked sweet potato and the baseball game afterward and the hug in the driveway. It was happening in small increments, the way real repair always happens. Not in one dramatic moment of resolution, but in accumulation. In the index card. In the first ring answered. In the weight of my son leaning into me in the driveway like he was 34 and 6 years old at the same time. But the thing I couldn't have told you in April, the thing I didn't know yet, was that the story had one more turn in it before it was actually finished. It happened in May. Landon called me on a Tuesday morning and he said, "I need to tell you something and I need you to let me get through all of it before you say anything." All right. Victor came to the office yesterday. I waited. He asked to meet with me privately. Not the board, just me. He came in. He sat down. He had a folder of documents. Landon's voice was steady but careful, the way it gets when he's reporting something accurately rather than reacting to it. He had put together a counter-proposal, a case for reinstating his informal advisory role, essentially. New consulting agreement, formalized this time, with compensation and title. He said it would give the company credibility with his network that the new board structure was costing us. What did you say? I'm getting there. A pause. He made the pitch, and it was actually a good pitch, Dad. He knows how to build a case for himself. He had numbers, he had projections, he had 3 specific accounts. He said he could bring back in the next 90 days if the advisory relationship was restored. Another pause. And sitting there listening to him, I felt it. The pull of it, the familiarity of it. Victor in a room with a folder and a plan and that voice he uses. And part of my brain going, "Bed, this is easier. This is the known thing. This is the path that already exists." I sat with that. I didn't say anything because I'd told him I wouldn't. "And then I thought about you under that truck," he said. "I don't know why that specifically, but I thought about you fixing that alternator yourself because you'd been meaning to do it and you finally just did it. And I thought about the 11 o'clock phone call and what it actually cost you to answer it. And I thought about the fact that easy is not the same as right." He stopped. I heard him breathing. "I told Victor no," he said. "I told him the board structure was final, and I wasn't going to route around it through a consulting agreement that would effectively give him the influence back without the accountability. I told him the company was going to stand on its own, and that meant without either his money or his name doing our standing for us." He paused. He didn't take it well. I expect he didn't. He said, Landon's voice shifted slightly. He said some things about you, about how what you'd done was calculated from the beginning, about how the trust was a control mechanism disguised as help, about how a father who really loved his son would have just given him the money without strings, without retaining interest, without keeping the legal leverage. I felt something move through me at that. Not anger exactly. Something more complicated. The particular sting of a person finding the exact angle of the knife that can get through. "And?" I said. "And I told him he was wrong," Landon said. "I told him the strings were Marcus's idea, and you agreed to them because you were protecting yourself, which you had every right to do. I told him that giving someone everything you have and asking for nothing in return is not a control mechanism. It's a sacrifice. And I told him that if he couldn't see the difference between the two, then we probably weren't going to see eye to eye on very much." He stopped. He left. We haven't spoken since. I sat in my kitchen with the phone against my ear and the percolator ticking on the stove and the late May light coming through the window over the sink, and I thought about Victor Ashcroft in his tuxedo with his easy laugh and his Atlanta business partners. And I thought about the things he'd said about me to my son's face, and I thought about my son defending me. "Landon," I said. "Yeah. Thank you." A pause. "You don't have to thank me for that." "I know I don't," I said. "I'm doing it anyway." He came over that Sunday. Not a planned dinner, not an occasion. He just showed up in the early afternoon with a six-pack of the decent beer and said he wanted to sit in the garage while I worked on a neighbor's carburetor I'd offered to look at. I said that was fine. So we spent 3 hours in my garage, me working and Landon sitting on the old stool in the corner with his beer. And we talked about things that had nothing to do with the business or the trust or Victor or the party in October. We talked about the carburetor. We talked about a baseball team we both followed with moderate interest and no real intensity. We talked about Ellen, the way she used to sing off-key to the radio when she cooked, specific and slightly embarrassing songs that we could both hear clearly if we thought about it. We laughed about that. Really laughed, the involuntary kind. It was the best afternoon I'd had in a long time. Around 4 o'clock, when the light in the garage was going golden and I was cleaning my hands on a rag, Landon said, "I want to ask you something." "Go ahead." "When you emptied your retirement account, when you made that call at 11 at night and decided you were going to do it, were you scared?" I looked at my hands, the grease under the 2 nails that never fully came clean. "Yeah," I said. "I was scared." "Of what? Losing the money?" "Of losing you," I said. "I was scared that if I didn't help, you'd lose everything and you'd spend the rest of your life carrying it. And I was scared of watching that happen to you when I had the ability to prevent it." I set the rag down on the workbench. That's the part nobody tells you about being a parent. The fear doesn't go away when they grow up. It changes shape, but it's still there. Landon looked at his beer bottle. "I didn't know you were scared." "I know." "You never seem scared." "That's not the same as not being scared," I said. "That's just what 67 years of practice looks like from the outside." He was quiet for a moment, then, "I think I'm scared too. About the business, about the next quarter, about whether I can actually do this without a safety net." "You can," I said. "You don't know that." "No," I admitted. "But I know what I've watched you do, and I know that the version of you that said no to Victor last week, that version, the one that made the harder choice, that's the version that's capable of building something that actually lasts." I looked at my son sitting on that old stool in the golden garage light. "The fear means you understand the stakes. That's not a weakness. That's how serious people feel when they're doing something that matters." He didn't say anything for a long time, just sat there with his beer and the late afternoon coming through the garage door, and I let the silence be what it was. "I'm going to name a conference room after you," he said finally. I looked at him. "What?" "At the office. We've got 3 conference rooms and they don't have names. They're just called by their numbers, which is boring. I'm going to name one of them." He had a very small smile on his face, the particular kind that meant he was serious but aware of the absurdity of what he was saying. "The Holloway room." "That's your name too," I pointed out. "Yeah, but everyone will know which Holloway." I looked at the ceiling of my garage, the water stain near the far corner that I had still not gotten around to fixing. "You don't have to do that." "I know I don't." He looked at me with his mother's eyes. "I'm doing it anyway." I let that sit there. The Holloway room. Somewhere in an office building in the city, there would be a conference room with my name on it, and people would have meetings in it without knowing anything about the man it was named for, which was fine. That was completely fine. It wasn't about anyone else knowing. It was about my son knowing, and deciding that knowing mattered enough to put a name on a door. "All right," I said. "All right?" "All right," I said again. He finished his beer. I locked up the garage. He stayed for dinner. I made what I always make when I'm not trying to impress anyone, which is a plain good meal with nothing complicated about it, and he helped me clean up after, which he'd never done as a teenager, and which I noticed. We watched the end of a game. He left around 8:30, and I stood in the driveway and watched the taillights of his car go down the street, and I went back inside. I sat at my kitchen table. The percolator was cooling on the stove. The house was quiet. I thought about Ellen. I thought about her the way I always think about her in moments like this, not with the sharp grief that used to come in the early years after she was gone, but with something softer, more like a long conversation I'd been having with her in my head for 6 years, keeping her informed, telling her what happened, letting her weigh in the way she always did. She would have had something to say about all of this, about the party and the attorney and the trust and Landon and Victor and the index card and the conference room. She would have had a lot to say, and most of it would have been right, and some of it would have made me uncomfortable, and I would have listened to all of it. I think she would have said, "You waited too long to say something." And I think she also would have said, "But you said it, and that's what matters." And then she would have made coffee and asked me what I wanted to watch. I miss her. Every day, and in the particular way that never really has a bottom to it, the way grief for the right person doesn't fully resolve into acceptance, but turns instead into something you carry so long it becomes part of how you walk. I want to tell you what I know now, at the end of all of this. Not because I have it figured out. I want to be very clear that I do not have it figured out, and anyone who gets to the end of a hard story claiming they do is either lying or has a simpler story than they're admitting. But I have some things, real things. Things I bought with the currency of a difficult year, and I want to put them on the table plainly because that's what this whole story has been building toward. The first thing is this: money is not love, and love is not money. But in families, the two things get tangled so completely and for so long that most people stop being able to see where one ends and the other begins. Victor Ashcroft was not a monster. He loved his daughter, and he expressed that love by making himself structurally necessary, by ensuring that the machinery of her life ran through him, by building a world where his presence meant safety and his absence meant risk. That is a kind of love. It is also a kind of control. And the tragedy of it is that Victor probably never saw the difference. He probably lay in bed at night genuinely believing he was a good man who had given his family everything they needed. He wasn't wrong about the giving. He was wrong about what it was for. I made a version of the same mistake from the other direction. I loved my son by making myself invisible in his success, by protecting him from even knowing the scale of what I'd given so that he would never have to feel the weight of obligation to me. I thought I was being generous. And I was, but I was also erasing myself. And the erasure was not just about me. It was about Landon. Because when you remove yourself so completely from the story, you deny the people who love you the chance to love you back correctly. You deny them the knowledge of who you actually are and what you've actually done, and then you wonder why they don't see you clearly. I had made myself impossible to see and then been hurt by not being seen. That is not entirely someone else's fault. The second thing is about dignity, not the word people use when they mean pride, not the version that requires an audience or a recognition or a seat at the front table. I mean the quieter kind. The kind that lives in how you treat yourself, in whether you believe your own life has value that exists independent of what other people say about it. I had let my sense of my own value become conditional on whether Landon acknowledged me, on whether Victor showed respect, on whether the room knew my name, and when the conditions weren't met, when the room didn't know, when the seat was given away, when the toast didn't mention me, something in me treated that as evidence that the value itself was absent. That is a dangerous way to live. It hands other people a power over you that they should never have. Your dignity is not in anyone else's hands, not your children's, not your in-laws, not the 300 guests at a party. It is yours, and it requires defense, and sometimes defending it means doing something uncomfortable and public and inconvenient for everyone in the room, including yourself. But the alternative, the long, quiet, accumulating alternative of swallowing it, of telling yourself it doesn't matter, of driving home alone at night and being grateful for small graces, that alternative costs more. It costs you slowly, in ways you can't always see until you're standing in a parking lot at 67 years old trying to figure out when it was exactly that you got sorted into the corner. The third thing, and this is the one I want to leave you with, is about what fathers and parents do, and what they're owed in return, and how those two things almost never balance the way they should. I gave my son everything I had, not as a transaction. not with expectation of repayment or recognition or a front row seat at his life. I gave it because I loved him, and he needed it, and I was capable of giving it, and those three things together made the decision simple, even when it wasn't easy. And I would give it again. Tomorrow, at 67 years old, with full knowledge of the party in October and the pillar and table 14 and all of it, I would do it again. That is the truth of parenthood that nobody adequately prepares you for. You give without guarantee. You sacrifice without contract. You empty yourself into another person's life, and you do not get to dictate what they do with what you've given. But, and this is important, doing it without expectation is not the same as doing it without worth. What you give has value whether or not it is acknowledged. Who you are has value whether or not anyone in the room knows it. The sacrifice is real even when it is invisible. And somewhere along the line I confused invisibility with insignificance, and that confusion cost me years of sitting quietly in corners when I had every right to sit at the table. If you're someone's parent and you have given quietly and been overlooked quietly for so long that the quietness has become a kind of drowning, I need you to hear me. You're allowed to surface. You are allowed to say, I was here. I did this. It cost me something real. And I deserve to be in the room. You do not have to hire an attorney. You do not have to create a scene in front of 300 people. Though sometimes, if you have been pushed far enough and the scene is the truth, then the scene is the truth, and you should not be ashamed of it. But you have to say something to someone in some form before the silence becomes the whole story of your life. The index card is still in the drawer in my bedroom. Dad's seat. I look at it sometimes. There is a conference room downtown with my name on it that I have never visited. Landon told me they put the name up in March, a simple plaque by the door, nothing fancy. He offered to take me to see it. I told him I didn't need to see it. He understood, I think, that the gesture was the thing, not the plaque. Landon calls me on Sunday evenings now. Not every Sunday. There are missed ones. Life gets complicated. Some weeks he's traveling or caught in something and the call doesn't happen. But most Sundays, we talk about ordinary things more than we talk about anything significant, which is how it should be. The significant things have been said. What's left is the ordinary life of a father and a son who found their way back to each other, imperfectly, incompletely, the way real things happen. Last Sunday he called me from his car. He was driving home from a meeting, and I could hear the traffic through the phone, and he said, "Hey, Dad, quick question." "Yeah." "You ever going to fix that water stain in the garage ceiling?" I looked up from my chair. Through the open door to the garage, I could see exactly the stain he meant. "Probably not," I said. "How long has it been there?" 7 years, maybe." "Dad, it's not structural," I said. "It's cosmetic. It looks bad. It looks like my garage." He was quiet for a second, and then he laughed. The real kind, the involuntary kind, the kind I used to hear in him when he was small, and something surprised him into it. It came through the phone and into my kitchen, and I sat there and listened to my son laugh about a water stain on a Tuesday evening in the ordinary light of an ordinary life that had been very close to collapsing and had not. That laugh, that specific laugh, at that specific moment, about absolutely nothing important. That's the whole story. That's what it was all for. I'm Graham Holloway. I'm 67 years old. I have grease under 2 fingernails that will probably never fully come clean. I drive a 2009 Ford pickup with a new alternator I installed myself. I make my coffee in a percolator. I'm not a complicated man and I do not need much. What I needed was to stop letting need be confused with weakness. And it took me longer than it should have to figure that out. But I figured it out. That's enough. I want to tell you what I know now, at the end of all of this. Not because I have it figured out. I want to be very clear that I do not have it figured out, and anyone who gets to the end of a hard story claiming they do is either lying or has a simpler story than they're admitting. But I have some things, real things, things I bought with the currency of a difficult year, and I want to put them on the table plainly, because that's what this whole story has been building toward. The first thing is this: money is not love, and love is not money. But in families, the two things get tangled so completely and for so long that most people stop being able to see where one ends and the other begins. Victor Ashcroft was not a monster. He loved his daughter, and he expressed that love by making himself structurally necessary, by ensuring that the machinery of her life ran through him, by building a world where his presence meant safety and his absence meant risk. That is a kind of love. It is also a kind of control. And the tragedy of it is that Victor probably never saw the difference. He probably lay in bed at night genuinely believing he was a good man who had given his family everything they needed. He wasn't wrong about the giving. He was wrong about what it was for. I made a version of the same mistake from the other direction. I loved my son by making myself invisible in his success, by protecting him from even knowing the scale of what I'd given, so that he would never have to feel the weight of obligation to me. I thought I was being generous, and I was, but I was also erasing myself. And the erasure was not just about me. It was about Landon, because when you remove yourself so completely from the story, you deny the people who love you the chance to love you back correctly. You deny them the knowledge of who you actually are and what you've actually done, and then you wonder why they don't see you clearly. I had made myself impossible to see and then been hurt by not being seen. That is not entirely someone else's fault. The second thing is about dignity. Not the word people use when they mean pride, not the version that requires an audience or a recognition or a seat at the front table. I mean the quieter kind, the kind that lives in how you treat yourself, and whether you believe your own life has value that exists independent of what other people say about it. I had let my sense of my own value become conditional. Conditional on whether Landon acknowledged me, on whether Victor showed respect, on whether the room knew my name. And when the conditions weren't met, when the room didn't know, when the seat was given away, when the toast didn't mention me, something in me treated that as evidence that the value itself was absent. That is a dangerous way to live. It hands other people a power over you that they should never have. Your dignity is not in anyone else's hands. Not your children's, not your in-laws, not the 300 guests at a party. It is yours, and it requires defense, and sometimes defending it means doing something uncomfortable and public and inconvenient for everyone in the room, including yourself. But the alternative, the long, quiet, accumulating alternative of swallowing it, of telling yourself it doesn't matter, of driving home alone at night and being grateful for small graces, that alternative costs more. It costs you, slowly, in ways you can't always see until you're standing in a parking lot at 67 years old trying to figure out when it was exactly that you got sorted into the corner. The third thing, and this is the one I want to leave you with, is about what fathers and parents do, and what they're owed in return, and how those two things almost never balance the way they should. I gave my son everything I had, not as a transaction, not with expectation of repayment or recognition or a front row seat at his life. I gave it because I loved him, and he needed it, and I was capable of giving it, and those three things together made the decision simple, even when it wasn't easy. And I would give it again. Tomorrow, at 67 years old, with full knowledge of the party in October and the pillar and table 14 and all of it, I would do it again. That is the truth of parenthood that nobody adequately prepares you for. You give without guarantee. You sacrifice without contract. You empty yourself into another person's life, and you do not get to dictate what they do with what you've given. But, and this is important, doing it without expectation is not the same as doing it without worth. What you give has value whether or not it is acknowledged. Who you are has value whether or not anyone in the room knows it. The sacrifice is real even when it is invisible. And somewhere along the line, I confused invisibility with insignificance, and that confusion cost me years of sitting quietly in corners when I had every right to sit at the table. If you are someone's parent and you have given quietly and been overlooked quietly for so long that the quietness has become a kind of drowning, I need you to hear me. You are allowed to surface. You're allowed to say, I was here, I did this. It cost me something real, and I deserve to be in the room. You do not have to hire an attorney. You do not have to create a scene in front of 300 people. Though sometimes, if you have been pushed far enough and the scene is the truth, then the scene is the truth, and you should not be ashamed of it. But you have to say something, to someone, in some form, before the silence becomes the whole story of your life. The index card is still in the drawer in my bedroom. Dad's seat. I look at it sometimes. There's a conference room downtown with my name on it that I have never visited. Landon told me they put the name up in March, a simple plaque by the door, nothing fancy. He offered to take me to see it. I told him I didn't need to see it. He understood, I think, that the gesture was the thing, not the plaque. Landon calls me on Sunday evenings now. Not every Sunday. There are missed ones. Life gets complicated. Some weeks he's traveling or caught in something and the call doesn't happen. But most Sundays. We talk about ordinary things more than we talk about anything significant, which is how it should be. The significant things have been said. What's left is the ordinary life of a father and a son who found their way back to each other, imperfectly, incompletely, the way real things happen. Last Sunday, he called me from his car. He was driving home from a meeting, and I could hear the traffic through the phone, and he said, "Hey, Dad, quick question." "Yeah. You ever going to fix that water stain in the garage ceiling?" I looked up from my chair. Through the open door to the garage, I could see exactly the stain he meant. "Probably not," I said. "How long has it been there?" 7 years, maybe, Dad. "It's not structural," I said. "It's cosmetic. It looks bad. It looks like my garage." He was quiet for a second, and then he laughed. The real kind, the involuntary kind, the kind I used to hear in him when he was small and something surprised him into it. It came through the phone and into my kitchen, and I sat there and listened to my son laugh about a water stain on a Tuesday evening in the ordinary light of an ordinary life that had been very close to collapsing and had not. That laugh, that specific laugh, at that specific moment, about absolutely nothing important. That's the whole story. That's what it was all for. I'm Graham Holloway. I'm 67 years old. I have grease under 2 fingernails that will probably never fully come clean. I drive a 2009 Ford pickup with a new alternator I installed myself. I make my coffee in a percolator. I am not a complicated man, and I do not need much. What I needed was to stop letting need be confused with weakness, and it took me longer than it should have to figure that out. But I figured it out. That's enough. To you, watching or listening to this, I want to say one thing directly, from where I stand having told this whole story. The people who love you quietly, who show up without fanfare, who sacrifice without invoice, they are not okay just because they haven't said they're not. Check on them. Not with a toast at a party, with a phone call on a Sunday, with a chair that has their name on it, with the ordinary, unremarkable, irreplaceable act of making sure they know they belong in the room. That is the whole lesson. Everything else is just everything else.